Hey everyone, welcome back to the Peace Among Friends podcast. So good to have you back here. Thanks for joining us. Hope all of you are having a great week. And if you're not, then I'm glad that you are reaching out and looking for some kind of help with your mental wellness. And today, what we are going to be talking about in the second episode of the Peace Among Friends podcast is triggers, warning signs, and coping skills. These are three basic fundamental aspects of therapy and of mental health. Anytime I would be teaching a group class, that is the number one thing that I would start with, and that is the basic skill that most therapists are going to start with when working with anyone new. So, starting with triggers. So, I'm sure a lot of people have heard the word triggers, but might not understand exactly what they are or what they are in a therapeutic sense. So, essentially, what our brains do anytime we are in a state of peril or if we're in danger of some kind, our brains will scan around the environment and they will remember some of the things that were going on, maybe not even necessarily related to the actual danger that we're in, but it could, be if something bad happened in a room with, red walls, then later on our brain could see red walls and immediately is going to switch and think danger. So that's the kind of thing that can happen with triggers is it might not even be related to the trauma that you've gone through or the incident that you've gone through. Sometimes it can be related around it. So essentially, whenever we are triggered, then we'll start to have warning signs. And I'm not going to go too much deeper into triggers right now because I am planning on doing a whole episode dedicated to it, and especially how trauma can come up in daily life. And especially whenever you're looking at PTSD, there's a lot of people who have PTSD out there. And sometimes those triggers can be what we call hyperactive, which means that your brain is starting to read a lot of things as dangerous, even things that aren't actually going to hurt you. So, right now, we're just going to go on the basic definition on what a trigger is. And essentially, whenever you have been triggered, then you're going to have some warning signs come up. So, let's go back to that same example of, the red walls. So, the red walls, you walk into the room, you see the red walls, and all of a sudden, you'll start having warning signs. This could be maybe your heart starts beating a little faster. Maybe you'll start feeling a little sweaty. Maybe you'll start being lightheaded. Maybe you'll just have a sense of fear come around you, anxiety, that kind of a thing. And whenever you're there, that is when we would tell you to implement coping skills. These are things that are designed to help tell your brain, I am not in danger right now. They're primarily relaxation techniques that'll help you go back to a state of calm. So, just to review, first you would be triggered, then you would experience the warning signs, and that's when you would implement coping skills. I also apologize for my phone going off several times. No one ever talks to me, but essentially the second I started doing this podcast, everyone I've ever met decided to send me a message. So again, apologize for that. And okay, let's keep going with coping skills because these are really important. So with coping skills, you're trying to tell your brain like, hey, everything's cool. Sometimes even a basic coping skill can be avoiding things that trigger you. So that could be certain people. Sometimes certain people can be triggering. They can, bring out certain aspects of yourself that you might not be able to deal with. In the sense, like some people can make you angry. Some people might just irritate you. Sometimes they might remind you of a certain situation that happened in the past that you don't want to be reminded of. And it's perfectly okay to get space from that person and to take a break and, let them know, like, hey, I have to, take some space for myself right now for my own mental health. That's how we would say, you're setting a boundary for yourself to help yourself. And we definitely encourage those in therapy. Other kinds of coping skills would be things that you can do. So there's coping skills you can do before you've been triggered, and there's some that you can do after you've been triggered. So something like boundary setting with certain people would be something you do before you would even be triggered, before you would ever have a warning sign. And there's other kinds, like I said, that you would do afterwards. So that's after something's happened, especially if, it's sudden, if it was not expected. Maybe you're out in public somewhere and you see something or smell something, something reminds you about something bad that happened in the past. You need to get your brain back into the present moment. I'm not there. That bad thing's not happening right now. I'm just in a grocery store and everything is okay. So, some ways that you would do that, one of my personal favorite ones is something we call grounding techniques. And with grounding techniques, you are trying to get your brain to understand, hey, I am in this moment right now. I'm safe. I am right here. I'm in this spot. So, some ways you can do that are just the most simple ways. You don't need any equipment or anything like that. So you're going to want to activate your senses. And of course, everyone listening is going to have different abilities, different limitations. So, if you're not able to stand, or if you're, listening and you want to try a grounding technique, but, even if you're paraplegic, you can try touching the roof of your mouth with your tongue. You can, try to feel what that texture is like. You're activating your senses in that sense. um, but anything like that, you're going to want to, feel what, if there's an air conditioner on in the room, what does that feel like on your skin? What does the air feel like on your skin? Focus on those kinds of sensory details that are around you in the present moment to let your brain know where you are. One of my favorite is touch a table. If you're next to a table, if you're standing on the ground, say, what do my feet feel like on the ground? If you have a table or you have a chair, what does the texture of this feel like? Is it hard? Is it soft? I'm even touching the table right now as I'm talking about it, and feeling it. Okay, so this table, it's made of wood. It's brown. I can see it's brown. It has kind of like a scratchy texture on the top of it. And, just describe in as much detail that object that you have, or, even if you don't have an object and you're just standing, what does the floor underneath me feel like? Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it bouncy? What color is it? What sound does it make? Anything you can do to activate your senses. What does it feel like? Anything like that will start to let your brain know, like, I am in this spot right now. I am in this present moment and everything is okay. And then you should start to see some of those warning signs decrease. So you might notice your heart rate start going back to normal. You'll notice your breathing will start to go back to normal. And you'll start to kind of have more of a sense of calm come back to you. So again, once we've been triggered, we implement coping skills to calm ourselves down. Before we've been triggered, we can implement coping skills like setting healthy boundaries to help avoid those. We can avoid certain places. Sometimes, especially with people who have had drug use and are trying to go through the steps to get over their addiction, there can be a lot of places, especially right next to their houses, that might be triggering. If you're walking by the same street where you used to buy drugs, that's going to be tough. That's going to be really hard. Maybe you'll have to go a different route. And I've worked with clients before who, didn't have the ability to, move. They didn't have the ability to go down a different street. Sometimes their drug dealer would literally be outside of their door yelling at them, hey, I know you're going to be back here soon. So that's whenever, there's always going to be things that you can't avoid. And that's whenever you really have to implement those certain coping skills that can get you back to regular, your baseline level quickly. Because a lot of the times when people are in those triggered states, first of all, it's not pleasant. You're not having a good time. And second of all, you can definitely lose control. A lot of people say, those are the times whenever they start going back to old habits, whenever you're talking about addiction, or if you're talking about trauma, you can definitely start going back into anxiety, into depression. Some people have panic attacks. And it was, even right now talking about it, I can kind of notice myself getting a little anxious. I'm just keeping a mental tally of my own warning signs. My breath is getting a little bit more shallow, probably talking a little bit quicker. I notice that my muscles in my legs are starting to tense up and I'm holding my hands together. So those are the things that I'm noticing in myself, even as I'm talking about this, that I have to be aware of so I can take that second and say, okay, let's implement some coping skills. So I'm going to feel the ground under my feet. I'm going to take a couple deep breaths. Just try to slow myself down, go back to a calm, comfortable level, and bring myself back to the present moment. They say that you should have one coping skill for every year that you've been born, every year you've been alive, not been born, because we don't get born every year. Silly. Yeah, they say that you should have one coping skill for every year that you've been alive. So, every New Year's, that can be one of your resolutions is I got to get a new coping skill. For some people, it can be a hobby. For some people, it can be just a new way to relax. I am going to do a whole podcast just on coping skills because that's something that I really like to work with people on and that a lot of people do find very helpful because there's things you can do to be a little bit more proactive. So that podcast is going to be about stress relief versus coping skills because there is a little bit of a difference. But they're both equally important, and it's really important that we take care of ourselves because stress can be so detrimental too. Like, I'm going to go into detail on that episode on, the physical effects of stress on our bodies and why it is so important to try to relax, which I'll try and make kind of funny because I do notice a lot of the times whenever I talk about stress, people get really stressed out, especially whenever you talk about like if you, have these levels of cortisol rising, your stress is high, your cortisol is going high, it's, having physical effects on your body. It's like, oh, it'll definitely stress you out. So I'm going to try and keep that episode light because you have to, anytime you're working with mental health, you do want to try to have a sense of humor about it. And there's a physical reason for that. There's the parasympathetic nerve system, you see. And in this nerve system, it's either happy or sad. Like if you've ever noticed, like if you've ever been really sad and then something just makes you laugh and it'll kind of feel like a weight comes off of you. Specifically, our nerve system is unable to feel happy and sad at the same time. Like you're not ever going to be happy while you're being triggered. You're going to be one or the other. So I do think it's important to try to have a bit of a sense of humor in this podcast. And I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm trying to make light of these issues. But mostly I am just trying to help people as you're working on this not to get triggered and not to be going down a dark road whenever I know that you're not in front of me. I would never want anyone listening to this podcast to start feeling things and me not be there to be able to, as we say in therapy, like close it up. Anytime you open something, you want to be able to close it. Anytime I would have a session, especially if we're talking about deep history of trauma, I would always want to make sure that I have a significant, like at least like 20 minutes at the end of the session of just making sure all those ends are tied up because you never want to send someone out into the world, dealing with those things. And that's why I do recommend again that anyone dealing with intense things or even just regular day-to-day stuff that might be hitting you, definitely work with someone face to face because there's only so much that you can do on your own. And sometimes if you start to try to work on certain things on your own, it can be very dangerous. And I would never want anyone to, listen to this podcast and leave with a feeling of being triggered and having past trauma coming up in your mind. That's definitely not my goal. And if that does happen, definitely seek out some resources. There's one of the best numbers that I would always give clients is the number for United Way. And I love them. You just dial 211. That's it. Just go on your phone, you dial 211, and they can connect you with all kinds of resources. They do housing, they have food resources, they have crisis lines. They have a little bit of everything. I'm looking up their website right now. And let's see what all they do. It's literally everything. yeah, they do education resources, financial stability. They have been very helpful in looking for housing for clients in the past, especially if you have any like issues with your landlord and might even need to take like legal action. I've had to uh, do that with a couple of different clients in the past, and United Way was some of the places that I started of just trying to get some immediate resources of people who, needed to have a house within, the next month. Like they needed a roof over their head quickly. They're an excellent resource for that. And they do have a lot of resources for crisis centers. There's also the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that is free and available 24/7. And that phone number is 1-800-273-8255. Again, that's 1-800-273-8255. And again, that's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So they do have people there 24 hours a day. It is free. And if, anyone is feeling like as they're, looking out for resources, if that's one of the reasons that you're looking for resources right now, definitely talk to someone who can talk back to you. These podcasts, I do want them to be educational and to help people who are in a situation to where they want to work on their mental health. But at the same time, if you are in a crisis situation at this time, definitely leave this podcast, call 911, and get some help as soon as possible. And that is something that I do take very seriously. And I really hope you guys, I know it's hard out there. It's so freaking hard. And it's hard even talking about triggers and warning signs and coping skills not to have some of that come up. But I do want to let you know that anytime I will be talking about triggers or trauma, especially in the PTSD episode, I'm going about it very, very sensitively. And I try to never say anything that will be graphic because there's no point. You really don't have to talk about details of bad things that have happened to people to talk about PTSD. If anything, you really don't want to, especially if people have PTSD, because then you're just going to activate their trauma, which again is not what we want here. And I did, in my master's degree, I did have my focus on trauma recovery. That was the number one thing that I really wanted to learn how to help people with. And the biggest and most valuable thing that I learned was whenever you're working with trauma, it's less about what happened in terms of recovery and more about what you believe about what happened. Like, what are your beliefs about yourselves? What are your beliefs about the world? What are your, what does your brain tell you about, the environment around you? That's more so what I will be focusing on, that, not details. I do not want to have anything graphic or sensitive in nature because even myself, I am susceptible to being triggered. I do have a history of PTSD myself, so I am very sensitive about that and want to make sure that I'm taking care of that, ethically speaking, and want you guys to know, like, as you're listening to this, anytime I would even dream of mentioning something that might be triggering to some people, I'll let you know and let you know when to skip to. And yeah, so I hope that can give some people some peace of mind. And I did go off on quite a tangent there, but those were some things that I really felt like needed to be said, especially anytime I'm talking about triggers. I take it very seriously. It is serious, and it's not something to gloss over. While I do want this podcast to be fun, I do want everyone to know that I am very serious about those topics, and I do not take anything lightly. So going back into our review, we've talked about triggers, warning signs, and coping skills. So triggers are things that your brain is telling you in the moment, hey, I'm in danger. Whenever people say online, where they joke about like, oh, they're triggered. It's like, yeah, because you've just reminded them of a situation that they've been in that was highly unpleasant. So of course people are going to get upset because in their brain, they feel like they're back in that moment. They're back in that time period where that bad thing happened. So again, whenever that happens, you have warning signs. I see often in comment sections, if I see someone said something and it was offensive and I see people in the comment sections getting very emotional, my first thought is, yeah, they're triggered. That's their warning sign. They're getting angry. They're getting defensive. Their fight or flight response is becoming activated. They're feeling like they need to fight because they feel like they're in danger. And of course, then we would recommend, hey, do a coping skill. If you feel like something is going on around you and it's out of your control, that's your time to take back that control by doing something active. You want to be actively doing something to cope. You want to actively do something to help calm yourself down. So that can be activating your senses. That can be doing some relaxation techniques, some deep breathing exercises. There's a great exercise called progressive muscle relaxation. And so on this podcast, once a week, I'll do an education podcast. And then the other podcast that we'll have during that week is going to be a relaxation exercise. So that's going to be the way that, we help practice and have that moment of calm. And I want to be able to get some of those, clinically proven techniques that help, especially with anxiety or depression. And that way, you guys will have some extra tools. You'll have some extra coping skills to put in we used to say it in my group, like our toolbox is what we would call it. So you literally think of like, I'm pulling out my toolbox and I'm getting this, thing to help fix this problem. Just like if your chair is broken and you sit down and it's wobbly, you got to go get, your Allen wrench and you got to tighten up those screws. So if you notice your hands are getting shaky, your breathing's getting labored, and you're starting to feel anxiety or depression, something like that, then that's whenever you would need to pull out your toolbox, get your Allen wrench, and do some progressive muscle relaxation. Again, if you're having a crisis, call 911. If it's not a crisis situation, that's whenever you need to do your coping skills. And I just always want to make that clear because it is very important that if you are in a crisis situation, you call 911. That is what it is there for. If you're listening in a country that's not America, then whatever your emergency services number would be, that's what you would need to call. So yet again, even in group, I would do this. I would say it multiple times of, circling back, triggers, warning signs, coping skills. So whenever you're triggered, notice your warning signs, activate your coping skills. And again, I'll be doing more in-depth podcast on each of these subjects later on. So if you'd like to check them out, if you're listening in the future and they're already there, then go ahead and look for those. All right, so now before we end, I wanted to go ahead and do some like outside work. So essentially, each podcast, I want to kind of give a challenge that I would like everyone listening to try and do over this next week. So over this next week, I want you to start identifying some coping skills. I think at least one. If you can do 5, that's great. If you can only do 1, that's great. At least one coping skill that you can find that is a healthy way for you to relax. So this would not mean like drinking or, anything like that. It would be something that is purely healthy, has no downside. So it could be like painting a picture. It could be anything that'll get you in the present moment. It could be doing some relaxation techniques. It could be listening to some meditation. It could be even just starting doing grounding techniques where you just kind of try to activate your senses, smell something that smells good, just at least one point in this week, try to do a coping skill, especially if you notice that you're being triggered or if you're having a hard time, if you start noticing any warning signs, that's when you would do your coping skill. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and comment below what your coping skill is. And I think that would be a great way for some people who might be stuck or, might say like, well, yeah, I can paint a picture, but that doesn't always work. Sometimes breathing doesn't always work. I would love it if you guys could share some of your coping skills in the comment section. So that way other people might have some, good ideas for things that they could try and, they might learn something. And I would love to learn too. I can always use more coping skills. I'm getting older, so I got to get some more. So just thank you all so much for joining me and for being here and listening to this podcast. Congratulations on, taking the time to try to work on your mental health. It takes a lot of courage and self-love to work on yourself, and I just really do commend you for that. It's not an easy thing to do, and you should congratulate yourself as well. And I'm excited to see what you guys want to share in the comment section if you do decide to share. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I just wish you all good, happy mental wellness, mental wealthy wellness. All right. Thank you so much again for joining me, and I'll see y'all next time.